The room smelled like recycled air and quiet dread. Marin had been awake since before the lights came on, before the pale blue panels along the ceiling shifted from dark to the cold white that passed for morning in the cohort. She'd been lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, running the same mental checklist she ran every night before evaluation. Systems architecture, xenolinguistics primer, threat response frameworks, the 47 fail-safe procedures for a hegemony encounter. All of it locked tight. All of it perfect, the way the Academy needed it to be. The number above her bunk read 27. She had not been called Marin in 11 months. She swung her legs over the side of the bunk and looked at the other 5. 12 was already dressed, sitting cross-legged on the floor, running a thumb along the edge of his thumbnail, the way he did when he was frightened and didn't want to show it. He had a name too, somewhere behind the number. She thought it might be something with a J. She hadn't asked. They'd been told early on that asking was inefficient. The Academy was efficient. Everything here was efficient, which was another word she had slowly come to understand for obedient. 32 was pacing. She paced when she was anxious, which was always, her bare feet whispering against the composite floor in a tight oval between her bunk and the far wall. 9 was still under her blanket, only a dark curtain of hair visible over the top, but Marin could see by the rhythm of her breathing that she wasn't sleeping. 66 was at the window. There was only one window, a slit 3 inches wide that looked out on a corridor and not the sky, pressing the tips of 2 fingers against the glass as though checking for warmth. And 4 was standing very still at the center of the room, fully dressed, staring at the door. They had been told graduation was today. The hegemony instructors called it the completion, final evaluation. One last lesson before deployment to the colony vessels, where each of them would serve as integration liaisons, the human interface between the new order and whatever was left of the species that had not yet accepted it. The Academy's word for the holdouts was inefficient. Marin had been told to use that word. She used it dutifully. She did not, in the privacy of her own skull, believe it. The door opened at 0600 exactly. The instructor who entered was called the Architect. That was the only name any of them had ever heard for it. It stood roughly 2 meters tall, pale blue-gray in the way of deep water, its face a configuration of mobile cartilage that might, in certain lights at certain angles, have suggested expression. Its uniform was clean and precise in the color of deep space. It carried nothing. It needed nothing to carry. The Academy had made that clear in the first week. The hegemony did not require instruments or props to communicate authority. Authority was structural, they'd been told. Authority was the room you were already standing in. "Good morning," it said. Its voice came through a small translator node at its throat, and the result was something very close to human, but not quite. The cadence slightly too regular, the pauses slightly too even. Today, you demonstrate readiness. 12 had stopped touching his thumbnail. He was watching the Architect with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to perform calm. Marin had gotten good at reading that stillness in the others. She saw it now in all 5 of them, spread across the room like a weather system. The performed calm, the careful blankness, the managed terror. She wondered if they could see it in her. The Architect moved to the front of the room, to the low dais where the evaluation table stood. On the table was a single object, a small gray cube, approximately the size of a fist. It had been there when they'd arrived 11 months ago. Marin had assumed for the first few weeks that it was decorative. She understood now that nothing in the Academy was decorative. "You have been prepared," the Architect said. "Optimized. The data you carry, your behavioral matrices, your compliance indexes, your integration protocols, these are functioning within acceptable parameters." It paused in the hegemony way, which was not a pause for breath, but a pause for effect. A piece of theater embedded in the language. "You are ready to serve." 66 turned from the window. "What's the cube?" she asked. 32 stopped pacing. The question hung in the recycled air. Marin felt something shift in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Something older than either. She watched the Architect turn its configuration of a face toward 66, and she waited. "A demonstration," the Architect said. It moved one pale hand toward the cube. The cube opened. Not in a mechanical way, not hinged or sliding, but in the way hegemony materials often moved, as though the geometry of the thing had simply decided to make room. Inside was a small screen, and on the screen was a grid of numbers. Not their numbers. Marin looked at the grid for a long moment before she understood what she was seeing. The numbers were organized in rows. Each row had an identifier on the left that she recognized after a second as a planetary colony code. She'd learned those in week 3. Next to each code was a population figure and a projected compliance index. And, in the rightmost column, color-coded in a deep amber that she'd also been taught to recognize, was a status field. The word in the status field, repeated down the column in amber, was pending. The final lesson, the architect said, is a decision. It allowed that to sit for a moment. Outside the window slit, a cleaning drone hummed past in the corridor. 3 of these colonies have failed to meet compliance thresholds. Integration has been refused. By the parameters of hegemony protocol, these populations are classified as inefficient variables. Another hegemony pause. You are being asked to authorize their correction. Marin heard Nine's breathing change under her blanket. Correction. That was the word. She had heard it before, in lectures, in the behavioral framework sessions, in the dense hegemony documents she'd been asked to translate during training. She had never been asked to define it aloud. She had never needed to. She knew what it meant. She had known since about week 4, in the specific, bottom-of-the-stomach way that you knew things you weren't supposed to know, things that lived just below the vocabulary the Academy gave you. Correction meant the end of the populations listed in amber. Correction meant 3 colonies, and everyone in them. 12 was the first to speak. How many people? He said. It wasn't really a question. The number was on the screen. But saying it out loud did something, named the thing. 412,600 and... How many people? He said again, and this time it was slower, and Marin heard the thing underneath it. The thing none of them had been permitted to use for 11 months. The thing with no efficiency rating and no place in any compliance index. He was angry. He was actually genuinely, humanly angry, and he was not hiding it anymore. The architect's face arranged itself into what the training materials would have described as a neutral configuration. The figure, it said, is not relevant to the decision. 4 turned away from the door for the first time since the architect had entered. He was the quietest of them, had been the quietest since day 1, before they'd had numbers, when they'd still been using names and hadn't yet learned not to. He walked to the evaluation table, and he stood in front of the open cube with the lit screen, and he looked at it for a long time. Then he closed it, not gently. He pressed the geometry of the cube closed with the heel of his palm, hard, a flat crack of sound in the quiet room. No, he said. It was, Marin thought, possibly the simplest word she had heard in 11 months. The Academy did not deal in simple. Simple was unsophisticated. Simple was unoptimized. Simple was the kind of flat, blunt, one-syllable human thing that the hegemony systems couldn't quite parse into the behavioral matrices they'd spent nearly a year filling her head with. The architect looked at 4 for a moment, then at the closed cube. You misunderstand the exercise, it said. I don't think we do, 32 said. She had stopped pacing. She was standing very still now, her arms crossed, her jaw set in a way that Marin associated with her best moments. The moments when 32 stopped managing and started being. I think, she said. We understand it very well. That's the problem. The architect's translator node clicked once. The authorization is required, it said. The evaluation cannot be completed without. Then it won't be completed, 9 said. She had pushed the blanket back. She was sitting up on her bunk with her hair loose around her face, and her eyes clear, and her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and put it somewhere past fear. Marin had watched 9 perform competence for 11 months. This was not a performance. We won't authorize it, 9 said. Any of us. Marin looked at 66, who was watching the architect with her fingers still pressed against the window-slit glass. 66 was the one she knew least, the most contained, the most careful. 66 had the highest compliance index in the cohort and had never, in 11 months, said anything that wasn't sanctioned by the framework. 66 looked back at her. We need to understand something, 66 said, addressing the architect. Her voice was measured, precise. The voice the Academy had made. Is this evaluation the only path to graduation? Or is this the graduation? A pause. Clarify. Is completing this authorization what makes us deployable? Or were we always deployable, and this is a test of whether we'll do whatever we're told when the ask is large enough? The translator node clicked again. Marin felt it in that click, not certainty, but the shape of a truth she had been building for 11 months, piece by piece, in the parts of herself the Academy had not managed to reach. The click was the sound of a calculation running. The hegemony did not click when they were comfortable. They clicked when the behavioral matrix was producing unexpected outputs. She was an unexpected output. All of them were. If we authorize this, she said, addressing the room rather than the architect, then everything they've put into us works. The training, the numbering, the efficiency language, all of it is designed for this moment. For when they hand us something that should be impossible to say yes to, and they've spent a year making it feel like we don't have a choice. She paused. We have a choice. 12 looked at her. His thumb was still. He was not performing calm. He was calm, in the deep, dangerous human way that was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something past it. We always had a choice, he said. The architect moved. It was not violent. The hegemony were rarely violent in direct encounters. That was a tool they reserved for what they called the correction events, the mass actions managed from a distance through systems and authorizations, and the signatures of people who had been trained to provide them. What it did was raise one pale hand and gesture toward the doorway, where 3 additional hegemony staff had entered silently and were now standing in a loose configuration that was designed to feel like a wall. You will complete the evaluation, the architect said. Marin stood up. She was not a tall person. She was not by any metric the Academy valued, a physically imposing one. She had been assessed in week 1 as moderate strength, high cognitive, moderate threat response. The threat response rating had always bothered the hegemony assessors slightly. She could tell by the way they noted it. Carefully, the way you noted a variable you weren't sure how to weight. She stood in the center of the room and she looked at the architect and she said, "We've been given numbers instead of names. We've been taught to call 400,000 people an inefficient variable. We've been optimized for 11 months to turn a human population into an abstract figure on a lit screen." She kept her voice level. Not calm. She was not calm. She was shaking slightly, in the hands, in the way she always shook when something really mattered. "You've done everything right. The design is good. We're very well trained." She looked at the cube on the table, and we're still saying no. The room was very quiet. The 3 hegemony staff in the doorway looked at the architect. The architect looked at the cohort. The cohort looked back. All 6 of them, standing in different configurations around the room, not arranged into any tactical shape, not performing any readiness posture. Just 6 humans occupying a space, meeting the gaze of a species that had spent 11 months determining the most efficient way to use them. The architect said, "This outcome is not within projected parameters." "We know," 4 said. And there it was, the human thing that the behavioral matrix kept failing to account for. Not the defiance, not the courage, not even the moral clarity, though all of those were present. It was the small warmth underneath, the faint sound of a joke in 4's voice, so quiet it barely registered, the tiny defiant absurdity of saying we know to a species that had built an entire system around never being surprised. It was the kind of thing that only happened when you'd been frightened enough for long enough and you came out the other side into something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like choice. Marin almost smiled. She did not, however, because the architect was now doing something with the cube, reopening it, reconfiguring the interface, and she needed to think, and she needed the others to think alongside her. And that was the thing about humans that 11 months of optimization had not been able to engineer out of them. They thought better together in ways that resisted the neat individual assessment columns of the compliance index. 66, she said quietly. 66 was already moving. Precise, efficient. The Academy's star pupil, right up until the moment she wasn't. She crossed the room to the evaluation table in 4 steps, and she pulled the cube out of the architect's reconfiguring hands, and she set it on the floor, and she stood on it. It didn't break. Hegemony materials rarely did, but it closed again, hard, and the screen went dark. The architect looked at the cube beneath 66's foot, then at 66, then at the wall of personnel behind it. "Remove them," it said. What happened next was not elegant. It was not optimized. It was not efficient by any reasonable definition of the term. 12 moved first, toward the leftmost of the 3 hegemony staff, not with any trained combat technique, but with the full-body momentum of someone who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it. 32 went right. 9 went for the door itself, for the access panel, her fingers already moving through the override sequence she'd been memorizing since week 6, when she'd first seen the maintenance tech use it, and filed the motion pattern away in the specific human way of storing information you aren't sure when you'll need, but you're damn sure you'll need. Marin went for the architect, not to fight it. She was not under any illusions about that. But the architect was the authorization point. The architect was the node. Everything in the academy ran through the architect's approval signature. And if the architect's approval signature was occupied with managing one unpredicted human standing 3 feet from it and refusing to stop looking it in the face, then the architect's approval signature was not managing the remote correction authorization. She stood 2 feet from the pale blue-gray face and she said, "I need you to hear me." The architect's translator clicked. "We are not variables," she said. "The people in those colonies are not variables. 400,000 is not an inefficient figure. It's 400,000 specific people who have individual memories and specific fears, and people who love them and routines they complain about, and jokes they tell badly, and things they're ashamed of, and things they're proud of." Her voice was steady now, steadier than she expected. "You've been building a system to handle that specificity by erasing it, by turning names into numbers and people into projections on a screen. And it works, on some people. For a while." She watched the cartilage of its face rearrange slightly. "But we're standing here, and we're saying no. And your matrix is telling you that's unpredicted because you built the matrix wrong." Something happened in the architect's face. It was subtle, the kind of thing that only registered if you'd been watching that configuration of cartilage for 11 months, learning it the way you learned any face, against your own will, in proximity. Something shifted. Not surprise, exactly. The hegemony did not do surprise the way humans did. But something in the calculation changed. Something in the weight of the output. She felt it. The matrix, the architect said very slowly, was built on prior integration cohorts. "I know those cohorts complied. I know." At what point, it said. And there was something in the cadence now that was not the usual rhythm of the translator node. Something slightly off measure, slightly unoptimized. Does the integration cohort not comply? "When the ask is large enough," she said. "When what you're asking them to do is something they'll carry forever. When you've accidentally taught them enough about each other to remember they're human." She paused. "You made a training error. You let us be a cohort. You numbered us, but we still ate together and slept in the same room and fought about things and learned each other's tells and fears. You built a group. Groups have." She searched for the right word, the academy word, and couldn't find it, so she used the human one, loyalty. The 3 hegemony staff had stopped advancing. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She became aware of it the way you became aware of things in very charged rooms, peripherally, as a change in the quality of the air. 12 had the leftmost one in a standoff that was not a physical standoff, but a staring one, which was somehow more significant. 32 had backed the rightmost one against the wall through sheer specific human presence. Not threat, exactly, but the refusal to be small. 9 had the access panel open and her hand inside it, and the panel was showing in pale amber the words, "Override active." 4 had picked up the cube from under 66's foot and was holding it in both hands. The room sat on a single breath. "You're going to send your correction signal," Marin said to the architect. "Or you're not. That's your decision. And if you do, then in 40 years the history of the integration will record that 6 humans from Academy Cohort 7 looked at a screen and said no, and you corrected them anyway. And whatever you built on top of that, it was built on that specific moment." She met the configuration of its face. "And if you don't, if you acknowledge that the decision was wrong and the method was wrong, and there's a way to do this that doesn't require 400,000 people to be erased so that a compliance index looks clean, then that's something different. That's the beginning of something different." The architect looked at her for a very long time. In the corridor outside, 2 more drones hummed past. Somewhere in the building, a ventilation cycle kicked over. The pale blue panels along the ceiling continued their unfailing simulation of daylight. "Your compliance index," the architect said at last, "was always noted as anomalous. I know. The assessors recommended extended recalibration. I know. You were considered a management risk from evaluation week 4. Marin looked at it. She was still shaking slightly in the hands. "What did you decide?" she asked. The architect set the cube back on the table. It did not reopen it. Its pale hand rested on the closed geometry for a moment, and then it removed the hand, and it straightened, and it said, in the careful, flat-measured rhythm of the translator node, "That management risk was a misclassification." She waited. "The cohort is not an inefficient variable," it said, slowly. "In the way of something being translated twice, first from the hegemony language, and then from something deeper. The cohort is a data point. That's not a data point, it said again. That indicates the matrix requires revision. The room exhaled. Not in relief, not yet, maybe not for a long time. There were still 3 colonies in amber. There were still 400,000 people with pending statuses. There was still an entire system of hegemony integration policy that had not changed because of one cohort in one academy room on one morning. Marin knew that. She held it in full. She did not, in this moment, let herself pretend it was over, but she had said no. They had all said no. And the architect was standing in front of her, not issuing a correction authorization, not calling in a larger team, not activating the recalibration protocol she'd known about since week 7, when she'd found the documentation in the untranslated file archive and quietly committed it to memory. It was doing the one thing she had not predicted. It was listening. Force set the cube down gently on the table beside the architect's hand. The gesture was quiet, almost domestic, the way you might set a mug down next to someone who'd had a hard morning. He didn't say anything. He had never needed to say much. He just set it down and stepped back and stood with his hands easy at his sides. 12 looked at Marin. She looked back. "What happens to the cohort now?" she asked the architect. Another click. Longer this time. The sound of a system running a calculation it had not been designed to run. "That," the architect said, "is currently being determined." Then while it's being determined, 9 said from the access panel, her hand still inside the override plate, "We'd like to know the names of the 3 colonies." The architect considered this for 4 full seconds. Then it reopened the cube. Not the amber columns. It navigated past them into a different layer of the interface, and it showed them, on the small pale screen, 3 names. Not codes. Names. Marin read them. She said them silently to herself, the way you said things you wanted to remember. She would carry them with her, those names, however this ended. That was the thing about humans and names. You gave them weight. You made them mean something. You couldn't help it. It was in the design. She looked around the room one last time. 12, his thumbnail quiet, his eyes open. 32, her hands uncrossed, still standing. 9, precise and clear. 66, her fingers finally lifting from the window glass. 4, gentle and still at the center. And she felt the particular deep, stubborn, ordinary human thing that had no name in any compliance index. The thing you could number all you wanted and it would still be there when the numbers fell away. She turned back to the architect. "Then that's where we start," she said. The pale blue panels above them held their light. Somewhere in the colony codes on the screen, 412,000 people were still breathing, still telling their bad jokes, still carrying their specific fears and private warmths into another morning they didn't know had almost been their last. The Academy's final lesson had not gone as designed. Marin thought, for the first time in 11 months, that she might be all right with that.